Hello, everyone, and welcome to another audio podcast in this series around the pathology storm. This is another Storm Robotics production in collaboration with the Renal Patient Support Group, the RPSG, and this is an audio podcast series around the Shientist Chartered Edition, following on from the previous audio podcast in this particular series. I'm going to talk about or provide an overview on the biomedical classification surrounding the coronaviruses. The full works will be available through the Renal Patient Support Group, the RPSG, in time. This work, or the overview that I'll be providing in this series, relates to an invited peer review manuscript that went in to contribute to a book chapter with fellow colleagues to highlight the renal or the kidney perspective in context of the coronavirus. So a bit about the biomedical classification side of things. Excuse me. So to begin with, coronaviruses are more recent discoveries more recent discoveries than adenoviruses. Adenoviruses, by the way, are part of are within the coronavirus family, or within the coronavirus taxonomy. Both fall under the same category, but adenoviruses has more taxonomy investigated. There's generally more around adenoviruses in terms of research than there is coronaviruses. At least in specific contexts. So the first coronavirus strain, B814, was discovered in the 60s, so in 1965, by scientists Tyrrell and Bynoe, where biomedical specimens were collected from the respiratory tract of a patient with a common cold. Subsequently, samples were then linked directly to human volunteers to develop the disease, and evidencing the presence of infectious agents. Thereafter, two of the investigators, Hamre and Procknow, were then able to grow isolated virus strains, including B814 and the 229E, which improved early biomedical sort of visualization in line in the context of extraordinary viruses. The morphological or homology of the isolates to the viruses of avian bronchitis and mice hepatitis were presented by two investigators, Almeida and Tyrrell, in 1967, in following the works of Hamre and Procknow. In the same year, at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, 6 additional viruses with morphological similarities were also isolated and grown in organ cultures instead of the usual cell monolayer culture. And then in 1968, a more in-depth investigation of viruses using electron microscopy revealed comparable priorities between them. So, for example, the size, the lipid layer, and the presence of surface spikes, i.e. the protein spikes that stem out from the taxonomy that relates to coronavirus, and then which resemble similar structures to the adenovirus. And again, like as mentioned, adenovirus and coronaviruses have some similarities in their molecular structure, and so in line with this, the peer review manuscript does have an illustration that regards the progression and discovery of novel subgroups of viruses and coronaviruses. I won't highlight the sort of context around the illustration of this audio podcast, but generally from the early 1960s to up to 2020, generally there has been intense research looking at adenoviruses, and in linking to the coronaviruses, and mainly the remit has been to understand really how the common in some contexts how the common cold, coughs and colds can be ameliorated in some regard, and so the illustration has sort of an overview of history going back to the 1960s up to 2020, in regards to the sort of progression of discovery of novel subgroup of viruses and the coronaviruses, and then following based on taxonomy and pathological features, a team of 8 virologists decided to classify coronaviruses as they are due to their characteristics and their appearance. Ongoing research and microscopy advances surrounding coronaviruses provided greater knowledge of viral structure and function to discover therapeutic possibilities surrounding unpredictable outbreaks. Advanced microscopy and visualization have since been more pertinent throughout practices and updates adjoining the pandemic. So regarding pharmaceutics, and I will provide a bit more around the therapeutics and pharmaceutics around coronaviruses in a subsequent podcast. However, suffice to begin with, at least to highlight that regarding pharmaceutics, angiotensin converting enzyme 2 or ACE2 has diverse interplay as SARS-CoV-2 impounds respiratory health, and the implications prompt symptoms that have been highlighted in the literature relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. The implications on health and disease have become sort of more obvious following the SARS outbreak, following following that outbreak in Wuhan, in the Wuhan province in China in 2003. And so in the subsequent audio podcast, I'm going to highlight a bit around the analyses of coronaviruses in correlation with renal health or nephrology and novel therapeutic strategies relating to preventing cardiovascular disease or CVD and COVID-19 symptoms. And COVID-19 symptoms are also considered in context with that. So this ends the audio podcast on this focus around the biomedical classification around the coronaviruses, and some aspects and in some aspects around the taxonomy. I'm the next, as mentioned in the subsequent audio podcast, I will provide a bit more around the renal health and COVID-19 correlation. This has been the Shientist. It's around the audio podcast series, the Pathology Storm. This is part of the Shientist Chartered Edition, and it's it's been another SZtorm Robotics production in collaboration with the Renal Patient Support Group, the RPSG. Thank you for taking the time to listen in.